Here are the main topics of chapter. These are the topics and learning objectives that you need to focus on. As you can imagine, globalization has become a major socioeconomic force and topic of debate in the 21st century. In Chapter 1, we examine the forces that are driving this phenomenon, as well as the often passionate criticisms of the globalization process. We will review the objectives that firms pursue when they engage in international business activities and describe the various modes of entry that may be used. We will also note the terminology that has come into existence as new types of organizations have evolved. The chapter concludes with a discussion of the conditions in a company's external environment that may affect its international operations. Here are the other learning objectives that we will be covering one by one, particularly working on assessing the major reasons why companies seek to create value by engaging in international business. Why do companies go global? And how do they go global? Therefore, we will define and illustrate the different operating modes for companies to accomplish their international objectives. Okay? Let's go one by one and start with the objective 1.1. Basically, we want to know why national differences in companies' external environments affect how they may best improve their IB performance. For instance, the conduct of a company's international operations depends on two factors: its objectives and the means by which it intends to achieve them. Likewise, its operations affect and are affected by two sets of factors: physical, social, and competitive, as you can see from this chart. So we have the operating environment of the business, which includes institutional and the physical factors, right? And then we have the operations of the company, which are listed under the objectives. And then the competitive factors in the operating environment include the rivals in the company, right? You need to look at the competitive product strategy, the company resources, and the competitors in each market. Okay? And then firms need to define, devise and implement strategies in order to achieve their objectives, right? So this strategy, there are different strategies that we will be talking about, and companies use different strategies in order to expand sales or acquire resources or minimize the risk. So we will be talking about different modes of entry into global markets, and the companies accomplish this goal by either franchising or directly investing or by seeking strategic partnerships with other companies. Okay? And when assessing where to invest and how to invest, we will be looking at the underlying alternatives, including the choice of the country, organization, and the control mechanisms. Okay? So if we look at the learning objectives, right, relate globalization and international business to each other and explain why their study is important. Okay? As people, firms, and other organizations have expanded their access to resources, goods, services, and markets across wider geographical areas, they have also become more deeply affected, both positively and negatively, by conditions outside of their home countries. So, to understand the impact of globalization on international business, we need to define what globalization is. Globalization is the widening and deepening of interdependent relationships among people from different nations. I'm repeating again. Globalization is the widening and deepening of interdependent relationships among people from different nations. The term sometimes refers to the elimination of barriers to international movement of goods, services, capital, technology, and people that influence the integration of world economies. Globalization obviously enables us to get more variety, better quality, and lower prices. The global connections between supplies and markets result from the operations of multinational corporations, which are all purely business, commercial transactions. Therefore, the reason why we're studying international business is because international business is a synonymous term for globalization. It makes up a large and growing portion of the world business. Today, no business is purely or remains purely as domestic, right? Businesses are becoming more and more global, and they make up a large and growing portion of the world economy. There is a very good chance that each and every one of you will be involved in international business in some way or the other, depending on the type of companies that you're working for. Therefore, studying international business is important because you can relate to international business from your own experiences of working for companies. It's also important because most of the companies are either international or compete with international companies. Modes of operations may differ from those used domestically. International business helps managers to decide where to find resources and where to sell them. The best way of conducting business may differ by country. And also an understanding of having a good grasp of international business helps you make better career decisions. An understanding also helps you decide what governmental policies to support and what governmental policies to oppose, either in host countries or in home countries. Okay? Let's focus on the learning objective 2, which is about grasping the forces that drive globalization. Because these forces obviously has been very hard to measure, right? So obviously globalization is driving engine of international business operations, right? But the key question is how to measure, identify, and quantify globalization. Okay? How to measure it, which indicators to use when measuring globalization. Because globalization obviously has been growing, right? Because the international commercial transactions have become more globalized, right? And also, globalization nowadays is less pervasive than generally thought, okay? There are unwelcome effects are less than what was originally thought. For instance, 15% of US consumption comes from other countries, right? 15%, not 50, 15% of US consumption comes from other countries. You might think that this number is much higher, but it's not. So therefore, it is extremely important to measure globalization properly and correctly in order to overcome face value suppositions, or in order to question hearsay and supposition about globalization. Okay, globalization has economic and non-economic dimensions, such as easing of travel, easing of people-to-people contacts, um, easing of the use of technology, and also it is stimulated by several factors. Currently, about a quarter of world production is sold outside its country of origin, which is also a perfect example of globalization. Don't forget, currently, about a quarter of world production is sold outside of its country of origin, compared to about 7% in the 1950s. So this tells you that not only the production, but also the consumption has become more and more globalized. So it's also important to review the studies beyond economic factors for the driving force of globalization. Okay? It is important to study beyond the economic factors. Okay? So far, we have given examples of economic factors that have driven globalization. For instance, size of the country matters, right? Size of countries is important. Smaller countries tend to be more globalized than larger ones, mainly because their smaller land masses and the population permit a lower variety of production. Don't forget, smaller countries tend to be more globalized. Probably their exports can be much higher than the exports of larger countries, mainly because their smaller land masses and populations permit a lower variety of production. Per capita income and social class is important. Countries with higher per capita incomes tend to be more globalized than those with lower ones, because their citizens can better afford to buy foreign products, travel, and also communicate with other countries. And there is also a big variety among globalization aspects. Although a country may rank as highly globalized on one single dimension, it may be quite lower on the other dimension, such as the United States, being very high on technological scale of globalization, but low on the economic ones. Okay? The second force, the second objective, learning objective, is to grasp the forces driving globalization and IB, right? There are seven factors. There are seven factors that are often cited as having contributed to the increased growth in globalization. Seven major factors. Factor one is the rise in the application of technology. Many of the proverbial modern marvels and efficient means of production have come about fairly recently. These include the new products, such as, for instance, handheld mobile communication devices, as well as new applications of old products, such as, Indian gar beans in oil and natural gas mining. Thus, much of what we trade today either did not exist or was unimportant in trade a decade or two ago. So we have seen a big development in communications and transportation that allow us to discover, desire, and demand goods and services from abroad. Another important factor is the second factor, right? second factor, which is the liberalization of cross-border trade and resource movements. What this means is that barriers to trade are dramatically reduced, right? To protect its own industries, every country restricts the entry and exit of not only goods and services, but also the resources, such as workers, capital, tools, and so on. But however, such restrictions have been dramatically reduced in the last 40 to 50 years, because these restrictions set limitations on the business operations of international companies. Because also the regulations can change anytime and therefore contribute to uncertainty in the world economy. Over time, however, don't forget, most governments have reduced such restrictions, primarily for three reasons. Okay? So focus on this factor, very, very important. The second factor is the liberalization of cross-border trade and resource movements. Focus on the second factor, right? Which we have argued that the governments have reduced those restrictions on the cross-border trade and resource movements. And there are primary reasons for that. What are the main reasons? Number one, our people, the people who live in those countries, like the citizens of those countries, they demand and want a greater variety of goods and services at lower prices. To be able to obtain diversity of goods and services at lower, cheap prices, the countries have to open their borders to international trade. The trade has to be free to be able to acquire goods at cheaper prices. And also the second factor is the competition that spurs domestic producers to become more efficient. If there is no competition from foreign companies, there will be no competition, there will be no innovation, okay? And there will be no efficiency. Therefore, competition is really the driving engine of more efficient mode of production. And also, there is always the expectation that the third factor, why the governments reduce their barriers to trade is always the expectation. The countries always hope to induce other countries to lower their barriers in return. If the United States lowers the barriers, then the United States will put a pressure on the European Union or other countries in the developing world to lower their barriers in return. Because the trade has to be free on both sides. If it is not free on one of the sides, one side is going to lose and the other side is going to gain. For both parties to gain, trade has to be free. Therefore, countries always hope to induce other countries to lower their barriers in return. And of course, the other factor is the development of services that support international business. Companies and governments have developed services that facilitate global commerce. For example, because of bank credit agreements, such as those clearing arrangements that convert one currency into another, and insurance that covers such risks as non-payment and damage en route. Most producers can now be paid relatively easily for their sales abroad. The other factor that is one of the driving engines of globalization is the growth of consumer preferences. More consumers know more today about products and services available in other countries. We can afford to buy them, we want the greater variety, we want better quality, and lower prices offered by having access to them. However, this demand is spread unevenly in the world economy because of uneven affluence, both among and within countries, as well as from year to year. The fifth factor is the increase in globalization. the increasing global competition. Increased competitive pressures can persuade companies to buy or sell abroad. For example, a firm like Apple or Google or Starbucks, right, might introduce products into markets where competitors are already gaining sales, or seek supplies where competitors are getting cheaper or more attractive products. The sixth reason that drives the globalization is the change in political situations and the government policies. Governments support programs such as improving airport and seaport facilities to foster efficiencies for delivering goods internationally. For instance, here's an example from our history, right? For nearly half a century after World War II, business between the communist countries and the rest of the world was mainly minimal. There was really no transactions, no commercial transactions between the communist countries and non-communist countries. But today, only a few countries are heavily isolated economically or do business almost entirely within a political bloc. In fact, political changes sometimes open new frontiers, such as diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba, right? Or the diplomatic relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those diplomatic relationships and the business relationships dramatically improved, okay? So today, don't forget, only a few countries are heavily isolated economically. And the last and the most important factor that drives globalization is this expansion of cross-national strategic alliances, right? It is the last factor, the expansion of cross-national strategic alliances. Governments obviously have come to realize that their own interests can be addressed through international cooperation by means of treaties, agreements, consultation. The willingness to pursue such policies is due largely to these three needs: to gain reciprocal advantages, to attack problems jointly that one country acting alone cannot solve, and to deal with areas of concern that lie outside the territory of any nation. Okay? If we look at the learning objective of this chapter, is to become more familiar with some of the criticism of globalization. Okay? The third objective is about becoming more familiar with the criticisms of globalizations. The supporters and defenders of globalization argue that globalization is a good thing because it increases the volume of business transactions, it promotes efficiency of production, and contributes to the growing consumer power. Okay? So globalization is good because it promotes free trade. When the trade is free, all parties, all parties benefit from free trade. So trade is beneficial when only all parties benefit. And this is possible only if trade is free. If there are barriers to trade, one side will gain, the other side will lose. It will be a zero-sum game. However, there have been some critiques of this globalization perspective and the free trade argument, okay? So we look at the anti-globalization forces, which have protested both peacefully and violently as they press for legislation and other means to stop or slow, or at least to regulate and to monitor the globalization process. So they have listed a number of concerns being the threats to national sovereignty environmental stress, and most importantly, growing income inequality. Growing income inequality and personal stress. So some people argue that countries' sovereignty is diminished because when foreign multinational companies come and take over a country's business operations, the domestic businesses might be ruined as a result of failure to compete with the big multinational corporations. Right? Local objectives and the policies may be negatively affected with pressure from globalization. In other words, countries may feel more pressure to conform to global standards rather than stick with their own national objectives and the policies and their national culture and identity. And most importantly, as a result of globalization, big fish may eat the small fish, right? Meaning that small countries may become more dependent on larger countries, right? So globalization, some people argue, it might reinforce cultural homogeneity, which is the Western culture, right? Right. So this cultural homogeneity is about that is the change to everyone being the same across cultures and losing their identity like language and culture. And some people also argue that globalization hurts the environment. It hurts the environment as these multinational companies throw their toxic operations and therefore destroy the environment. So they're talking about greater carbon footprint, right? Greater carbon footprint as products travel from one country to another. Greater carbon footprint as a result of increased travel. However, the argument here is that the increased cooperation between countries to be concerned with environment may be an upside. Some people lose both relatively and absolutely. The other concern is the income inequality. Okay? The income inequality in that the disparity of incomes may grow. The gap between the social classes may widen as globalization occurs, and also this leads to greater insecurity, leading to personal stress. So stress results from real and perceived economic social positions by individuals. Being able to see what others have and don't have with the click of a button, just like TV and internet, it might contribute to further stress levels of people. And the fourth objective is to understand the major reasons why companies seek to create value by engaging in international business, right? Why do companies seek to create value by engaging in international business? So the key question is, why do companies engage in international business? Why do they want to move offshore? Why do they want to go global? So one reason given for this is the expanding sales, right? Sales expansion. And the potential to reach out to customers worldwide. Okay? So being able to attract more potential customers worldwide. A company's sales depend on consumer demand, period. Obviously, there are more potential customers in the world than in any other country. Now, higher sales ordinarily create value, but only if the costs of making the additional sales don't increase disproportionately. So therefore, when the companies engage in international business, they make a cost-benefit analysis. How much of their income will be generated from sales outside of the home country, and what is the cost of making additional sales? The cost of making additional sales should not increase disproportionately. Okay. The second reason is to acquire resources, right? Resource acquisition at a lower cost, and also acquiring new or better products is one of the fundamental reasons why companies engage in international business, right? So we have the producers and distributors who seek out products, services, and resources and components from foreign countries, right? Mainly because in the domestic country, domestic suppliers might be inadequate. For instance, industrial diamonds in the United States are inadequate. The reason why the US companies are engaging in acquiring resources from other countries, is mainly because the domestic supplies are inadequate. Okay? Companies are always looking for anything that will create a competitive advantage. This might also include acquiring any resource that cuts the cost. Acquiring any resource that cuts the cost. This is one of the reasons, for instance, think about Apple. Why is Apple acquiring resources, meaning the microchips from China, rather than buying them from Intel, which is an American company? Because buying from Intel is more expensive than outsourcing or directly producing the microchip in China using Chinese labor. Okay, think about this Apple Intel example when thinking about the resource acquisition. It's much easier to outsource the microchip from China than buying it directly from Intel, which is an American company. Okay. The third reason why companies engage in international business is risk reduction. The need to minimize risk. Risk reduction, the need to minimize risk. So, risk reduction can be due to differences in business cycles and also to prevent competitors from gaining advantage. Selling in countries with different timing of business cycles can decrease swings and the instability in sales and profits. Okay? So the companies are always looking for increasing the sales stability through operations in other countries that enter and recover from recessions at slightly different times. At slightly different times. Remember, when we had the financial crisis in the United States during 2008, other countries' economies were prospering. The economies of Latin America, the economies of Southern Europe, such as Turkey, Eastern Europe, and especially the economies of Latin America, Brazil and Argentina, their economies were booming. So a lot of investors, due to the difference in the timing of the business cycle, a lot of countries began to a lot of companies, multinational corporations, began to invest in those booming economies, whereas they started pulling out their operations from the United States because we were facing a recession here, whereas the other countries were experiencing booming economies. Okay? The other objective, which is the learning objective 5, is to define and illustrate the different operating modes for companies to accomplish their international objectives. So, what are those different operating modes, or what are the modes of entry into international business? Okay, So the first thing that we will be looking at, the merchandise exports and imports. Merchandise exports and imports are obviously tangible products, right? They are the tangible products, they are the goods that are respectively sent out of and brought into a country, right? So one way to engage for companies, one way to engage in international business is by exporting and importing, in other words. Exporting and importing merchandising. These merchandises are tangible products, goods, right, that are respectively sent out of and brought into a country. The other mechanism is to use the service exports and imports. Service exports and imports are different than merchandise exports. Why? Because they're also referred to as invisibles. Okay? Whereas merchandise exports and imports are referred to as tangible products, service exports and imports are invisible. Okay? Why do we call them invisibles? Because the provider and the receiver of payments makes a service export. The recipient and payer makes, right, a service import. The provider and the receiver of payment makes a service export. The recipient and the payer makes a service import. For instance, think about the services. Services constitute the fastest growth sector in international trade and take many forms. So for the second category, here are some examples. Here are some examples for service exports and import. We're talking about the tourism and the transportation sector. We're talking about the service performance, like the financial services industry, like banks, for instance, banks which charge fees. And also, we're talking about the asset use, such as royalties from licensing agreements. The third form, or the mode of entry into international business, is through investments. The third mode of entry into international business is through investments. So there is a direct investment, which is also known as FDI, foreign direct investment, sometimes simply referred to as direct investment. What this means is that the investor takes a controlling interest, meaning ownership, in a foreign company. What this means is that the investor takes a controlling interest, ownership in a foreign company. Let's assume a company like Walmart, for instance. A company like Walmart is directly investing in Mexico by buying a local supermarket chain. Okay, this is kind of the strategy that the Walmart uses in Latin America. Buying local supermarket chains is a form of direct investment because they are taking a controlling interest in a foreign company, as well as hiring the nationals of the foreign country. Okay. The second form of investment is a portfolio investment. Okay, so we talk about the first one, foreign direct investment. The second form of investment is a portfolio investment. Portfolio investment is obtaining a non-controlling financial interest in another entity. It means obtaining a non-controlling financial interest in another country or entity. Okay, so it consists of shares in or loans to a company in the form of bonds, bills, notes purchased by the investor. Don't forget, this time The company buys a share, but a non-controlling share in another company, either in the form of bonds or bills or notes purchased. Or it can be a minority share, but it's a non-controlling share. Non-controlling share most of the time means a minority share, less than 50%, like 20%, 30%. It's a non-controlling share if it is less than 50%. Right? And we will also talk about the other objective, right? The other objective, which is define and illustrate the different operating modes for companies to accomplish their objectives. What are the different operating modes? Or what are the different operating forms for companies to engage in international business? One way to engage in international business is to form a multinational enterprise. Multinational enterprise. It's called MNE, or sometimes called MNC or TNC. Multinational enterprise is a company with foreign direct investments. Okay, it's a company with foreign direct investment. Basically, Apple, right, is a multinational company. Google is a multinational company. Starbucks, right? Chase Manhattan, Blackstone, BlackRock, right? All of these private equity firms, they are international companies, because this is basically an international company is any company operating in more than one country. But a variety of terms designate ways of operating. Companies also engage in international business through collaborative arrangements. So what are those collaborative arrangements? It can be in the form of a joint venture, licensing agreements, management contracts, minority ownership, or it can be in the form of long-term contractual arrangements. Okay? So I'm repeating. Collaborative arrangements can be in the form of, number one, joint ventures, licensing agreements, management contracts, minority ownership, and long-term contractual arrangements. Sometimes we use the term strategic alliances for collaborative arrangements. It's the same thing. Strategic alliance is a synonymous term for a collaborative arrangement. But it usually refers either to an agreement that is of critical importance to a partner or one that does not involve joint ownership. Okay? And it is also important to understand the last objective, to understand why national differences in companies' external environments affect how they may best improve the international business performance. So we're going to look at the physical factors. Those physical factors are geographic barriers like mountains, deserts, jungles, landlocked areas, right? These type of factors often affect communications and distribution channels of businesses, right? And also we will look at the importance of the natural disasters, right? These disasters or adverse climatic conditions can make business riskier in some areas than in others, while affecting the supplies, prices, and operating conditions in far-off countries. Then we need to look at under the physical factors, we have two types, right? We have the geographic, and then we need to look at the demographic factors. Demographic factors are all about how the countries differ in many ways, such as population density, education, age distribution, life expectancy, mortality rates, social class. These type of differences impact IB operations, such as the market demand and the workforce availability and so forth and so on. Under the second factor, we have the institutional forces. Institution refer to a system of established and prevalent social rules that structure social interactions. Language, money, law, systems of weights, measures, table manners, and firms are all institutions. Okay? So when we're talking about institutions, we're really referring to a system of established and institutionalized, prevalent social rules. Some examples include, such as culture, politics, law, economy. They all go under institutional factors. And finally, we have the third factor, which is the competitive forces. The competitive forces are all about the rivalry in the marketplace, the number of rival firms in the marketplace, right? We can measure competition with different factors, but one way of measuring it is to look at the number and the strength, of the rivals, the suppliers, the customers, and the rival firms, especially the rival firms. Most of the time, companies compete by means of cost or differentiation strategies. The latter usually by developing a favorable brand image, usually through advertising or from long-term consumer experience with the brand. One way for companies to differentiate themselves, from their competitors is, as I said, to develop a favorable brand image, either usually through advertising or from long-term consumer experience with the brand. Or the company needs to develop unique and distinctive characteristics, such as through research and development efforts or different means of distribution. Again, we have discussed the meaning of globalization in today's lecture. We also discussed the learning objectives of this chapter, specifically discussing the factors that drive globalization and how globalization had an impact on international business operations. Next class, we will be looking at the institutional and the environmental context of international business. Thank you for listening to my lecture, and I will see you in chapter 3. Have a good day. Bye-bye.